Hi there, my name is Philip Ideson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. And today on the show, I'm joined by three guests from the Hackett Group. I'm joined by Andy Warzecha, the Principal and Chief Market Intelligence Officer, Chris Sawchuk, Principal and Global Procurement Advisory Practice Leader and a longtime friend of the show, and Rick Gardner, the Director of Finance Transformation. Now, a few weeks ago, I got wind of an initiative by the Hackett Group to analyse procurement tech, starting with P2P providers, based on their business impact. They called this initiative the Hackett Value Matrix, and I was just really interested to learn more about it, why it was created, and what were some of the findings in that first version. So I reached out to the Hackett Group and I invited them onto the show so I could learn a little bit more. So let's go into the conversation. I started by asking Andy, Chris, and Rick, and starting first with Andy, to just explain a little bit more about their role at the Hackett Group.
I'm Andy Warzecha. I'm a Principal and Chief Market Intelligence Officer at the Hackett Group. My team and I are responsible for producing our value matrices, which we're going to talk about today.
Yeah. Chris, how about you?
Absolutely. My name is Chris Sawchuk, and I'm a principal at Hackett as well as Andy. I'm actually lead our global sourcing, procurement, supply management advisory business for the firm. And many of you may not know what that is, but it's really the place that we advise several hundred different organizations in many ways to guide and enable their transformational journeys. And we do this, again, on a global basis with a team of folks in multiple different locations on a geographical basis.
And Chris, you're likely no stranger to a lot of the Art of Procurement audience. You've been very supportive of us through the year in doing a variety of different podcasts and events. So it's a pleasure to welcome you back onto the show.
Well, I appreciate it, Phil. Thank you.
And Rick, last but by no means least, if you could introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, hi, Phil. I'm Rick Gardner. I'm a director in Hackett Strategy and Business Transformation Practice. I'm involved with actually delivery of client engagements, whether that's assessments or initiatives or implementations. And my role was the lead analyst in the Hackett Value Matrix that we're talking about today.
So I'm going to stick with you, Rick. And when I first heard about the Hackett Value Matrix, it definitely raised my eyebrows. I was really interested in what it was and what it's all about, which is actually why I initiated the conversation, which has led to the podcast today. So I just wonder if you could give us a high-level overview of what the Hackett Value Matrix actually is.
Yeah, sure, Phil. I think where we wanted to focus with the Value Matrix was really, if we looked at the marketplace, there's a lot of great information out there relative to capabilities and functionality and market presence of these different solution providers. But we found that materials do tend to be very focused from the solution provider's perspective. Mm-hmm. What we wanted to do is really think about that from the lens of transformation, which is kind of the core of our business, as well as advisory and benchmarking, and really take that client's perspective in terms of really what are they looking and expecting to get out of these solutions? How does it fit into their broader transformation initiatives?
Yeah.
And really how quickly and effectively can these solution providers help to get them there?
Mm-hmm. And Andy, could you take us a little bit behind the curtains to just kind of shine a light on why the Hackett Group actually decided, you know what, this is something that we're going to focus on, and this is something we're going to look to bring to market?
Sure. Well, procurement is one of the areas we do focus on at the Hackett Group, and we have thousands of customers that are actually interested in this area. And as I think your audience recognizes, despite there being a long history of solutions in this space, it's still a high value producing area.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of new capabilities introduced recently. You look at artificial intelligence coming up as a top topic in this area. There's a lot of noise happening, not only in procurement across the board, but this is one of those areas that returns investment. So you look at the responses that we got during this particular study, 89% of the practitioners in this area say that they have actually gotten what they expected out of their implementation objectives. Yep. 84% say they're satisfied with the solutions that they're implementing. So there's still innovation happening here. There is still change happening as far as vendors displacing one another. So it remains a high interest area with high return for our customers.
Yeah, I know it's a little probably cliche to say, but change is happening faster than ever among the procurement technology market. And I think something that we see at Art of Procurement all the time is that there's this explosion in potential providers over the last 3 or 4 years, really. It's funny, before that, it was relatively slow growth in the number of new players coming to market. Now there's an explosion in new players coming to market, some which have really interesting and innovative things, and some which may be a little bit more Me Too solution or vertical specific rather than being agnostic. And so there's a lot of confusion out there, I think, in the procurement space about how do I make sense of all of this? And I think that's only getting that confusion is only getting bigger than smaller. It's not a problem that's going to go away anytime soon. Building on that, Chris, when you think about P2P and the impact that all these different solutions are having in the P2P space, how does the Value Matrix actually capture that impact that each of the different solutions that you're looking at, that you're reviewing, actually have on the businesses that they're supporting?
Great question. And it's really the reason that we actually got into this is looking at the impact on client performance. You can look at a lot of things and understand, different solutions and features and functions, et cetera. But at the end of the day, it's about, are the clients that they're enabling with their solutions having an impact? Are they improving their performance over time? And one of the things that most people know about Hackett is that we've been benchmarking organizations, focusing on the performance of those organizations for over 30 years. And so the idea was, how do we bring this capability into this area of evaluating and looking at these solution providers in a different way? One of the things, I'll give you an analogy. So a lot of organizations, as they go out and they consider various solution providers, they put business cases together. And in putting those business cases together, they tend to have to highlight various performance measures to whoever they're having to, present that business case to within the organization. It may be that this, by putting in that particular solution, it's going to allow us to drive more value in terms of cost savings to the organization. And so they're trying to put a story together about a return on investment of this overall solution itself. What we're suggesting is that we got to look at that afterwards, sort of pre and post, implementation. So now that it's actually in place, what is the value realization of this solution? And I'll give you a couple of different examples. One of the things that organizations will look at their purchase to pay solutions is the adoption of the suppliers. If you go out and you put the solution in, how many of those suppliers that you have out of your entire supply base are actually engaging in the solution?
Yeah.
Because engagement is going to drive value. And so what we looked at was the adoption levels. Because if you have higher adoption, what we saw in the top performers or the top quartile performers, adoption levels of 68% of their suppliers being adopted in those solutions versus the average of 44%. And so when you look at that, say, well, what does that 68% mean? Well, if I have more suppliers adopted in the solution, that's going to provide me greater spend visibility. And we know from benchmarks that we do that higher spend visibility, correlates to greater spend cost savings. And we can highlight and quantify that. So this is really what we wanted to bring into it, is that impact, that realization of the value by these, these clients of the solution providers themselves.
Yes. So you're looking at for each provider the adoptability and I guess the stickiness. Once it has been implemented, you've been through the change journey. that that is actually then leading to the desired outcomes that's built in a business case. Because I'm sure you've seen many more times than I, and I've seen plenty of times where you see business cases that never really came to fruition. You look back 2-3 years down the line and you look and think, like, where did these numbers even come from?
Well, it's the old argument around ERPs. I mean, so many business cases that are put together to justify the investment of an ERP, but I'm not sure anybody actually goes back, or very few, to say, did it actually meet the business case that we actually put together, and how well did it perform? So, we're just highlighting is that there is a performance that has changed as a result of whatever solution that was put in place. And I think the other thing that's important, Phil, as you look at this, it's not just the solution itself, the features and all of those types of things. It's how well it's implemented as well.
Yeah.
So you can have a great solution that's sitting on the shelf that's not necessarily being utilized in the environment. Well, part of that is inherent on that supplier, that solution provider, to ensure that whatever they put in there is actually being adopted and utilized to the best degree. Because they ought to be looking at the impact they're having on those clients, not just they have the solution, but the solutions are being absorbed, adopted, and utilized within those environments.
Mm-hmm. Now, Rick, as you were doing the analysis around the findings and all the data that you were getting from this the study that goes into the value matrix, what were some of the things that you were kind of identifying as being the difference makers between those providers where the impact was clear and those where it perhaps wasn't so much and the business case wasn't met?
Yeah, I think that ties a lot into what Chris was talking about just a minute ago, Philip, in that the suitability of the solution in particular for the particular client situation in many cases led to either full value realization or partial or maybe dissatisfaction in some cases. The different clients we spoke with, which we talked about 130 different clients, were in different phases of either sophistication or complexity in terms of their procurement organization.
Mm-hmm.
Some might have been more regional nonprofits, some were large global complex, some were in pretty difficult industries. But what we tended to see was some of the solutions fared much better for organizations maybe that were looking for speed and simplicity and less training, versus others that really wanted maximum transactional channel coverage. So from that perspective, picking the right solution for where they were at in that maturity curve in many cases drove more value and benefit and more satisfaction too.
Mm-hmm. Chris, I'm going to follow up for that. I just want to is it clear, do you feel that providers are clear when they're in their go-to-market positioning, in your experience of doing implementations, where they can have the biggest impact? Or do you find a lot of providers are, I want to get the revenue I can get and then kind of help figure it out as we go along, versus being very specific around, this is my target demographic where I know I can have the biggest impact the quickest?
I believe the solution providers are quite clear, and I believe most of them articulate where they're going to have the biggest benefit in the organization. And the reason I say that is that the sophistication of the supply management organizations in the buying and purchasing of these solutions, they're putting together business cases. So the solution providers have to be quite articulate and knowledgeable about the impact of their solutions, because it's one of the ways that organizations are making decisions in terms of who do they want to go with. There may be, something maybe is the fact that it's easier to use. We're going to get higher adoption rates. And as a result of that, it's going to drive more value. And so they're building that into their business cases. So, I think the bigger challenge is, are we going back after and looking at it and did what we were told actually meet the expectations that we set with the business? And that may be an area that we have a gap in organizations.
Yeah, and isn't it interesting that oftentimes when that gap becomes apparent, the provider is already past the point of no return with the client because the relationship's been damaged. And so if that monitoring was ongoing, then that gives you much more opportunity to pivot and adjust and do all the things that help keep things on in line with what the business case is, as opposed to we didn't get what we want. Now it's apparent we didn't get what we want. So now we're going to rip it out and put something else in instead.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, again, I that's why I believe that it's really important that the solution providers understand it's not just about providing a technology solution, but that solution actually drives value in the environments that they place it in. And that's where they have a responsibility to ensure that the implementations, the adoption go well in that organization, because it has a long-term effect. The ability for them to expand to other areas if they have a narrow solution that they put in, like purchase to pay to begin with, to other areas. If the first one wasn't adopted well and they didn't realize the value from it, there's going to be little likelihood that they're going to be able to expand that relationship into other areas of the entire source to pay, set of activities looking forward.
Now, Andy, we hear a lot about generative AI and machine learning. It feels like we've heard about machine learning and AI for a few years now. And then, of course, generative AI in the last almost 12 months since ChatGPT certainly came on the scene. So lots of buzzwords in procurement. I wonder if you could share some of the findings about kind of the differences between the messaging that providers are using versus the impact that those solutions that claim to be using machine learning and generative AI are actually having.
Yeah, thanks. And it's a great question, because there is a lot of hype in this space. And when I say this space, across well beyond procurement around the impact of AI. And every vendor has a strategy in this area. It was very interesting kind of comparing and contrasting what was showing up in terms of their strategy, the marketing message, and then looking at the reality of what the customers were actually doing and deriving from that. So, it's still early days. There is solutions that are making their way out to the field that are AI oriented at this point.
Yeah.
What's interesting, though, is the rate of change that's happening here, because for me, and I've been in IT related areas for well over 30 years, the rate of change that's happening around AI and how it's making its way into products, really across the board for all the vendors that we looked at, is staggering. So, a few areas that I want to point out here where we see development making its way from the product labs into what customers are actually doing with it. So virtual assistants are getting upgraded. Guided buying, the ability to actually do supplier risk rating, the ability for accounts payable automation, and some of what typically had been business rules oriented, now getting transformed into more AI type capabilities. Smart coding, and one that came across nearly from every vendor, the fraud prevention and detection elements. So there's a broad swath of capabilities that are making their way out into the market. And, again, all boats float here. So this is one of those phenomenons where, yes, there's implementation differences between the vendors, but the reality is we're going to see this as increased efficiencies and increased benefits for clients across the board here. So this is great news.
Yeah, so it's not just necessarily the hype. The hype is becoming reality.
It is. It's still early days, and I suspect we're going to be seeing some not only benefits, but we're also going to see some interesting dynamics of how AI impacts the way organizations are operating, both positively and negatively as they adopt the tools. You always have that with early stage adoption.
What's interesting to me, I think, is for somebody who's buying procurement technology, is how to separate the hype from the reality, because every provider is going to be talking about AI, because to not do so puts them at a competitive disadvantage, at least in their positioning. But the reality on the ground may be different. I mean, are there any red flags or questions, or kind of any advice that you can give on how to differentiate a company that's really that is talking the talk, so to speak, and one that it's in positioning, but it's not necessarily in product?
Yeah, I think you've got to be careful here, because fundamentally, when you're looking at a purchase to pay solution, in the procurement areas for organizations, there's still fundamental things that you're trying to get out of those environments. Greater speed, greater visibility across the purchasing channels and the like. So those things still remain core. So, I would give you advice and don't get distracted by the new bells and whistles. You still have to focus on those core fundamental areas and the difference that it's going to make to your environment in the procurement cycles. But there are augmentations that are going to be happening at a relatively fast pace across all the vendors.
Yeah.
So advice, don't get distracted by the bells and whistles. Focus on the core competencies and the returns. This whole collection of vendors have done a very good job of providing return on investment. So implementation partners become critical, but don't get overly distracted by the AI hype.
Right.
Yeah, and I think, Phil, I would just add one, comment to what Andy has said, is that it goes back to, what we were talking about earlier around the performance, the objectives of why you implemented something in the first place. Why did you put a solution in? And, whatever AI does, or generative AI, it has to impact those. And so don't lose sight of why you're doing or implementing or investing in a particular area. If generative AI is coming in versus, it's just a label, to your point, everyone has to answer the question of what are you doing and how are you leveraging and how are you integrating AI or generative AI into your product? Everyone is doing that. The question is, how is it impacting the things that you were doing before, the kind of value that you're creating? How is it making that even better in this new environment once you've adopted that? And to me, that will be the difference in terms of how well they're doing it. And it's more than just hype.
Yeah, and it requires, it's a whole different train of conversation, I think, but it also requires a digital literacy from a skill set perspective, doesn't it, within procurement organizations to actually take advantage of some of these technologies?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we could have another whole hour-long conversation in terms of the impact on the people, in terms of, what generative AI will do, and the impact. Andy referred and alluded to that a bit. I mean, there's going to certainly be positive impacts, but, one of the research papers that we, released a few weeks ago, was highlighting, an expected 40% impact on the staffing levels within the G&A functions within our companies over the next 5+ years. That's significant. Yeah. So, if that's happening, how are we going to deal with that on a go-forward basis?
So something else I feel like we talked about a lot, Chris, and we could probably talk about forever, is the value, like the sources of value that procurement can generate and the value beyond savings. Has this research effort kind of given you an opportunity to push into forms of impact, when we talk about impact and outcomes, that are more difficult for procurement to quantify, and risk, I think, being one example of those?
Yeah, not on this go around. In this particular area, I'll just say that, when we decided that we were going to move forward in this whole market intelligence area and bring a new approach to the marketplace, one of the things that we decided was let's test this in a more mature area.
Yeah.
I mean, I would argue that purchase to pay is one of the more mature areas, if not the most mature area, when you think about all of the various processes within procurement. And so the opportunity was to apply it in an area that was well-defined, and also an area that had well-defined metrics, whether those metrics had to do with, cost or operational costs, whether they had to do with savings, whether it had to do with cycle times. They were well-defined measures that organizations were using in this purchase to pay process. And so we really wanted to go in there and say, listen, we're going to come in, into an area that's very well mature.
Yeah.
And you could imagine some of the conversations that we were having with some of the solution providers when we highlighted that we're going to be entering into the purchase to pay space. A lot of, some of the organizations said, well, why do we need somebody else in this space? This space has been evaluated by multiple different organizations out there and multiple times. What's going to be different? And so this was a way to, I'll say, cut our teeth in an area to say, okay, we're going to come in, but for all of the reasons we've been discussing, the focus on the impact these solutions are having on those clients, what value they are realizing, we're going to test in an area that is well defined.
Yeah.
And so that was one of the reasons we started here. But the question that you ask in terms of, how do we go into other areas? And a great area that would be an example, and it was an area that we considered as we were trying to decide where do we start with this, at least in the procurement space, is risk. Risk is a very difficult area. First of all, it's very complex. If you think about the solution provider marketplace that's out there, it's evolving. And so it's not as mature. The other thing is risk, and supply risk is difficult to quantify. So, if you look at it today, we did a study about a year and a half ago looking at third-party risk management.
Mm-hmm.
And when we went out to a lot of our clients and asked them, how are you quantifying risk, right? How are you justifying the investments, whether it be in technology and people, in this particular area? Because it's always been difficult. It's been difficult pretty much up until the point of the pandemic, when the whole focus on risk was elevated. But a lot of organizations were using things like risk indexes. Right? Where were we before? And do we believe that we're at a lower level of risk because of these changes we made? We went from a supply base that had a single source to multiple sources. You would say yes. Now, can I quantify that? That's difficult to quantify, but I do know that because of multiple sources, I have a higher degree of supply continuity and less risk on a go-forward basis. Other organizations are using revenue at risk, margin at risk.
Mm-hmm.
All of these types of things, the number of events that are occurring, the impact of those events, et cetera. So it'll be something that we're going to have to contend with, because some of these other areas, to your point, are less quantifiable. And so how do we bring that value realization in those areas, similar to what we've done in the purchase to pay area as well?
Yeah, to figure out what actually impact, how do you measure impact? Across all these different organizations. Rick, I'm going to come to you in a moment. Andy, I just want to ask you a question to just jump off what Chris was talking about there, because Chris talked about impact. And actually, Chris, something you said when, the conversations that you were having with the providers about, why is there another, kind of research study and methodology in this space where there's a few already? And that was my first thought, honestly. That's why I was really interested in this conversation. So you talked about impact. So Andy, why did you feel it was important for the value matrix and for procurement, really ourselves, to actually focus on business impact as being the measure that drives performance ultimately?
Yeah, it's an area where if you look at a lot of the analyst firms and what they produce out there's a lot of time spent on looking at feature functionality. Mm-hmm. There's very few that really look at, are we getting the results that we expect? And most importantly, for those that are actually providing top results out of their organizations, can I compare my organization to them? Yeah. Now, that may be viewed as traditional benchmarking at a detailed level, but we're trying to take a look at that in terms of, is the area that we're drilling down in our value matrix an area where you're going to see benefit from, and specifically where? So let me answer those questions in regards to this study here. So, were buyers getting the value they expected out of procurement? Mm-hmm. Almost 90% of those that we interviewed and surveyed said that their purchase to pay solutions here were a good investment for them. Yeah. So there's a return happening here, but then you got to take it to the next level. What type of benefits should I be getting when I compare those that are actually getting top performance marks in these areas? So there's a number of metrics that we produce in the report here. So, 73% of the top performers achieve touchless requisition to PO transaction automation, mm-hmm. that automation function. That gives you a number to benchmark against where your own organization is. And you start quantifying some of these things. So part of what we've done is we've taken a hypothetical $10 billion company. So, we didn't arbitrarily pick that number. If we look at our customer base, our customers tend to fit in that range. But if you look at the annual spend, savings, and avoidance for a typical $10 billion organization, this set of technology for top performers is saving them 35 to 45 million annually. Mm-hmm. I mean, that ability Yeah, so there's huge areas here, and I do want to point to a couple of areas that came out in the study that organizations should be thinking about and benchmarking, or at least thinking about where they're at relative to the top performers. So we are seeing better adoption in terms of the new user interfaces that are coming out from the providers in this space. The greater spend visibility is another area that came up, and this is an area that we do expect that artificial intelligence will have a market difference in it, as we saw demonstrated by some of the vendors, not only in their own demonstrations, but with customers using it. That ability to be able to surface those things directly in their environments and create flags that are more than just the traditional business rules based. First pass matching on electronic invoices, just the processing electronic invoices, and then supplier onboarding, the seamless integration of catalogs. These are all areas where the top performers were generating far better results than just the average. So again, these are areas where we think that approach that we're taking to look at the value being realized, not just at an aggregate level, but drilling into the specific areas where we saw differentiation as we talked to the clients that were implementing these technologies, regardless of what the vendor was. So we think this is a differentiator for us in the market. We think we're providing value from this.
Now of all those, when you're talking about spend visibility, I feel like for years and years and years, we've been waiting for the next generation of spend visibility. And so it's exciting to me that some of these new technologies that are coming along, we talked about earlier around AI being, a key area where it can do that and not be business rules based. I'm excited to see the impact of that in the market, because I think that's a huge thing for procurement. Rick, I promised I was going to come back to you, and one of the points in the study that was really interesting to me was that the research found 51% of participants had to make significant configuration modifications to the solutions before they were ready to deploy. So, half are basically they can't take an off-the-shelf product and plug it in. They're having to do some significant modifications. Did that impact value delivery or adoption in any way?
It did. And, probably the first and most obvious impact was on the timelines. We tended to see the timelines about 25% longer than what even the customers expected. So their planned versus actual timelines definitely extended in those situations. And really, there was kind of two elements that played off of that. One was, what was the level of effort that it took to make those modifications, and how technically skilled were the resources required to do that. So some of the solutions, the way their configuration is set up, easier, doesn't require specific IT type skills or technology capabilities to be able to execute, versus others where you really were reliant on the solution provider or very specific knowledge sets to be able to make those changes. The ones that required the very specific technical skill requirements tended to lead to less satisfaction and, again, longer timelines. In the end, what we tended to see, most of the organizations were able to configure to the specifications of the client with that additional timeline. The ones who didn't, to Chris's point earlier, we heard really negative satisfaction considerations and considerations of either not expanding on that platform in the future or switching over to other platforms in the future.
Interesting. So are you seeing that, that configuration is an inevitability around the solutions we're talking about the procure to pay solutions, or that actually there's a push by providers to make it a lot more of an easier plug and play onboarding, so there isn't all this complexity for configuration? Do you see us going further towards that, or is it just something that we're kind of stuck with? There'll always be a degree of some complex modification and customization.
I think there's some degree that will always be there. I do think the solution providers have definitely pushed to try to make their solutions flexible enough to handle particularly some of the industry vertical type challenges or some of the specialty purchasing, things like research and high-tech engineering or regulated purchases. So in general, I think where they've tended to excel is they've used these use cases that they've worked with, and they've come up with an approach to be able to apply those across those verticals, and in general covering a lot more in that, we'll call it now, out of the box industry kind of vertical type solution, where some of the others, the solutions maybe that are don't have as much client experience or breadth, are still coming up on that curve.
Yeah. No, I know we're coming up on time to close out the conversation today, but I did have one last question, Chris, for you around maturity. And I think we talked a little bit about it throughout the conversation, but I'm interested in how you allowed for differences, or if you allowed for differences in procurement maturity and sophistication when actually trying to measure the impact of a given solution, because as we mentioned before, a lot of it is on kind of the digital literacy of the teams themselves to get the most out of some of these solutions.
Right. It's a great question. And the reason is that a lot of times you look at, benchmarks and, you say, well, where do we start from? The fact that we were focusing on the outcomes, the maturity in terms of where they started really wasn't a factor.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you get a whole bunch of folks, lined up, and you want to compare them. Where they start really is irrelevant to what the outcome is. So, what we're looking at are the outcomes on the other side. So you've adopted a solution, or you've implemented and adopted that solution. What is that output performance of your organization in all of the areas that we've highlighted? And that really should be the factor in terms of how you do this comparison, irregardless of where you were starting from there. But I think the point that we've made and continue to make is that it's not just about the solution itself. It is about how it's adopted, how it's implemented, how it's integrated into those environments has as much impact on the delivery or the value being realized as the solution itself. And so that in totality really is something that has to be evaluated. And it's really not relevant or really dependent on where you start.
But as Rick alluded to, some of those solutions are going to be easier than others
Exactly.
to implement. And so that does then show up in the value that you can derive from those specific solution providers.
Exactly.
Well, I know it's time to wrap. Chris, Andy, and Rick, I want to thank you so much for your time today. I have one last, what I always say is the easy question. And Andy, I'm going to post this to you for the final word. If anybody listening to the podcast today is interested in learning more about the Hackett Value Matrix, they're interested in some of the findings, or just getting in touch with you and your team to learn a little bit more, where would be the best place for them to go?
Well, they can certainly search for the Hackett Group or just go directly to thehackettgroup.com. There's actually an abridged version of this report available. If you go to our site and you go to the market intelligence area, you'll be able to register and download.
Okay, perfect. Well, what I'll do then is we'll dig out the link to that and we'll include that in the show notes for today's podcast episode. Anybody listening, that will be at artofprocurement.com/podcast. That's artofprocurement.com/podcast, where we put all the podcasts that we record and all the different notes and the links associated with each one of the conversations. So you will find it there. So one last time, Andy, Chris, and Rick, I want to thank you so much for your time today. If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, an event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.